C-SPAN's America's Book Club programming is brought to you by the cable, satellite, and streaming companies that provide C-SPAN as a public service and is supported by the Ford Foundation. From the nation's iconic libraries and institutions, America's Book Club takes you on a powerful journey of ideas, exploring the lives and inspiration of writers who have defined the country, in conversation with civic leader and author David Rubenstein.
As a young boy growing up in Baltimore, I went to my local library and was inspired to read as many books as I could. Hopefully people will enjoy hearing from these authors, and hopefully they'll want to read more.
Now, married journalists and authors whose books include Kremlin Rising, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III, and The Divider, Trump in the White House 2017 to 2021. Peter Baker and Susan Glasser.
Thank you, both of you, for being here. We are at the Madison building of the Library of Congress. You can see James Madison here, who was the person who had the original idea for the Library of Congress. And as some of you might have heard me say before, his idea was proposed in 1783, and Congress got around to it in 1800. So it took a long time even then to get anything done. We have two really special guests today because they are a husband and wife team. They have separate journalistic careers, but on 3 occasions so far, they've written books together. And they are still happily married.
Yes.
Jimmy Carter, from whom I once worked, told me that the only time he came close to getting divorced was when he and Rosen agreed to write a book together. And they had so many fights that they basically gave the money back to the publisher and they wrote separate books. You've never had this problem. It's easy for you to work together?
We're still on speaking terms.
Okay. So you've written 3 books together, but before we get into that, let's give a little bit about your background. Susan, where are you from?
From Montclair, New Jersey.
Okay, and you went to high school in?
In Montclair, New Jersey.
Okay.
And then in Andover.
In Andover?
Mm-hmm.
And then you went to Harvard?
I did.
And you were on the Crimson?
I was. That's where I spent most of my time in college, working on the paper.
And did you know then you wanted to be a journalist your whole life?
Definitely from the time I walked into the newspaper in college. It was, a great experience. And so I came to Washington as an intern in the summer after my freshman year in college, and basically liked it so much. It was a small newspaper covering Capitol Hill. I went to work there after college, and I stayed there for 8 years.
You didn't go to Harvard.
I did not.
Your background is a little different. Your parents were both journalists or writers, is that right?
They were legal and business publishers. My dad was a lawyer. They founded the Legal Times newspaper here in Washington.
And were your parents working together?
They were, yeah.
And did you say, well, you can work together and have a happy marriage as well?
Well, they had 4 kids, and they got married right when they graduated from college. So I guess I didn't know it was weird, which may be why we're working together.
Right, so Peter, you grew up where?
I grew up here in the Washington area in Northern Virginia.
Northern Virginia, and your ancestry is Greek?
Yeah.
So your grandparents came over?
Yep.
And was it hard to get away from Greece in those days, or you don't know?
Yeah, my grandfather was a draft dodger. He came from the Ottoman Empire at the time and didn't want to be drafted into the Turkish army to fight other Greeks. And so he, at age 15, left home and came to the United States and went where all good Greeks went. He went to West Virginia.
All right, and you went to Oberlin.
I did.
Great school. What year did you graduate?
Trick question. Didn't graduate. I left in 1986. It was a mutual thing, but I had a great time while I was there.
What did you say your parents, they want you to live the American dream, and you dropped out of college? What did you say to your parents?
Yeah, that didn't work out so well. They were very understanding, actually. They understood that I had already gotten the bug, the journalism bug. I was so excited about getting into the news business, and I just wanted to get going. And I was lucky enough to get an internship and start from there.
You have one son who's just graduating from Stanford, I guess, and he's a journalist as well. We'll talk about it in a moment. But if your son had come to you and said, I'm dropping out of Stanford, what would you have said?
Oh, that actually, he talked about that, and I said, oh, no, please don't do what your dad did. Do as I say, not as I do.
Okay, so today...
He's much smarter than I am, though.
Well, he's very famous. We'll talk about him in a moment. But you didn't graduate from Oberlin, but you got a job as a journalist, and now you are the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, and you've covered the White House for the Washington Post and New York Times for 20 years. Is that right?
30.
How many?
30.
30 years. How many presidents have you covered?
Well, it depends on how you count Trump, but he would be my 6th presidency. Let's put it that way, 5 presidents.
5, okay. And you've worked for a number of publications, Politico, Foreign Policy, Roll Call, and also the Washington Post?
Right, that's where we met.
Right. So you were both at the Washington Post at the same time?
Yeah.
And did you ultimately work together at the Washington Post in Russia, or?
We did.
So you were one of you was the bureau chief, or both of you were the bureau chiefs?
Both of us, yeah.
We were the co-bureau chiefs. We met, we like to say we're the only good thing, David, that came out of the whole Monica Lewinsky situation.
All right, so you're the co-bureau chiefs of the Washington Post in Moscow, okay? And so now you're currently at the New Yorker writing about the White House in Washington, and you're writing about the White House for the New York Times. But both of you are journalists, but you also had time to write books. How do you write books while you're a journalist? Do you take leaves of absence? Is that what you do?
Well, Peter has done that. In fact, he's on a book leave right now. I'm still writing a weekly column for the New Yorker, but the answer is it's not that easy to do it. Writing books, as you know, is a late night occupation, a weekend occupation, and something you do in between. We wrote our first book, which was about our experience in Russia and during Putin's rise, when we moved back from Russia at the end of 2004 when I was pregnant with our son.
So let me ask you, when you're writing a book, does somebody say, I'll write one chapter and then you can edit it, and the other person says, I'll write a chapter and you can edit it? Is that how it works or not?
That's pretty much it. Yeah, exactly. We divide them up. We trade them back and forth. We write them. They get edited. And they eventually, over time, come together. At least that's
you write them
the way
at
it works.
home, or when you're writing books?
Yeah. We're working at the house.
And you do handwriting, or you use computers?
We do use computers.
It's a new thing,
So when you're writing, let's suppose you're writing a chapter,
Yeah.
and then you editing it, and you're tough on the editing.
Oh.
Then when she writes a chapter, are you tough on the editing, or you?
Well, you got to understand, okay, how do we meet? We met in the Washington Post newsroom. She was an editor, okay? She was the deputy national editor for investigative news. I was a White House reporter. So when we met, actually, we were already working together in a way. Okay. And so we have, over the years, been partners in so many different ways that it's natural for us to trade and to edit each other and to give up each other ideas.
Okay, well, is there anybody else that you know of who are writing books together, who are happily married after working all these years together as journalists and as writers? Anybody else like this?
Well, there are a few, yes.
Not that many.
Our friend Kai Bird, who's working with wife Susan Goldmark.
Their new biography, I'm reading right now. It's actually a terrific biography of Roy Cohn.
Yeah, coming out soon.
The Rosetta Stone to Donald Trump.
And when you do your books, do you do research and then write, or you research and write, research and write?
That actually is a good question. So each of we're now working on our 4th book. It's really been a different fact set. So the first one was about Russia, and it was based on reporting that originated with the work we did for the Washington Post, but then we went deeper. So that one was kind of easier. We made a kind of a plan for the book. We divided it up, half the chapters, and it grew out of work that we'd already started to do, and then maybe we did more. The Baker biography, a biography is a story of somebody's life. It's a really different kind of research. We had a different approach to that. Then we did this book about Donald Trump's first term. And in that situation, I think, first of all, we're trying to do it very quickly. And it's more similar to the one we're doing now. We did a lot of interviews, more than 300 interviews after Trump left office. And then we divided it up and wrote the chapters separately.
So an issue that journalists often have, Bob Woodward has always had to struggle with this as well. If you're a journalist, and even if you take a leave of absence, and you get a scoop, do you say to the newspaper, well, you're paying my salary for much of the year, I'm going to give you the scoop and put it in the newspaper? Or do you say, no, I'm saving it for the book? How do you deal with that?
Well, one way we deal with it is we're writing books about things that have already taken place rather than things that are currently going on, right? So when we sat down and wrote the Trump book, it was about the term that had ended. It was not an ongoing story. So there wasn't that kind of instant conflict.
Although we actually did do there was news breaking after Trump left office, and we actually did do a piece in the New Yorker before we had written the book about some of our reporting about the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, and his concerns at the end of the Trump presidency about Trump escalating with Iran and,
Okay. Well, I don't want to cause any marital problems, but let's suppose you're working on a book and you get a scoop, and who gets the scoop to go and say it's something that's current, and you want to take to the New York Times or New Yorker? Who gets the chance to give it first to somebody?
Oh, you're a troublemaker.
You must have thought of this.
I'd like to hear Peter's answer to that question.
This never happened. This hasn't happened. Okay.
Well, she brought the Iran scoop to our reporting, and then she reported it in the New Yorker.
Okay. Let's go through. I'm going to talk about your son first. Your son, your only child, right?
Our best collaboration.
Okay.
That's right.
Your son went to Stanford, and he's graduating this year. And he did a piece for the Stanford newspaper, I guess it was, that led, in effect, to the president of Stanford stepping down. So can you describe that? And were you shocked that your son had that much impact on a university when he's just an undergraduate?
He had always said he would never be a journalist. He did not want to be like mom and dad. Totally understood that. He went to Stanford, as far away from home as he could go. And then one day in the fall of his freshman year, he calls and says, I might work for the student paper for a little while. I said, okay, that sounds like fun. And he calls back a few weeks later and says, I'm investigating the president of the university. Like, are you sure? You just started. Maybe you could start with a professor or something like that. But he came on to some really interesting stories about papers that the president of Stanford had written or co-written, and there was some falsified graphics and data in these papers. One thing led to another, an investigation by the university, and yeah, he ended up having to step down.
Oh. Okay, let's talk about the 3 books you've written and the book you're writing. The first book that you wrote together was about Vladimir Putin. So did you ever actually meet Vladimir Putin?
Yes, we did actually meet Putin. This is, in the, I guess, how they used to refer to the Soviet Union, to the vegetarian phase of the Soviet Union. This was in Putin's vegetarian phase, the early years before he was invading his neighbors and things like that. And we landed in Moscow, basically, at the very beginning of Putin's presidency. And he was very wary of the press. He'd already cracked down on the independent media in Russia. But his first summit meeting with George W. Bush, remember that was the moment when Bush said he looked into his eyes and, Putin was somebody we could do business with. And right after that, a week later, Putin invited the American bureau chiefs to the Kremlin for his first session with them. So I went to that one, and it was really illuminating. I went back and looked at the transcript. So we're sitting at this round table in the Kremlin, very beautiful double library, and it's late at night. Putin, kind of like a Saudi prince, he brings people in late at night. He's going around, he still wants to prove himself. He's kind of a technocrat. He's memorized the briefing book. It's all very, kind of modern, calm. And then I realized with a sinking feeling that I'm the newcomer here, and no one's asked him about the war in Chechnya and all the terrible human rights abuses. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, maybe, my colleague will ask, and maybe and nobody asked. And I thought, the honor of the American press corps requires me to ask about Chechnya. And so I was like 2/3 of the way around the table, and it got to me. And I said, well, what about these terrible human rights abuses in Chechnya? And it was amazing. His visage changed completely. He got really angry. And, it was this very revealing moment. And he said, what do you want me to do? You want me to sit there and read the Quran with them? These are killers. These are terrible people. And it was scary.
Does he understand English?
A lot of English, and more now, obviously, than he did then.
But he doesn't speak it.
We're told that he's understands enough to, interject, but not enough to,
So based on your knowledge of him, how many years were you in Moscow?
About 4.
Were you surprised that he decided to invade Ukraine?
Well, I think when we were there, he was consolidating power at home. So what we saw was a crackdown on internal dissent, on the media, on businesses, and so forth. parliament, the governors, and Russia was still weak relatively compared to where it would be later. It was only after we left that he became more aggressive because he had strengthened his position at home. So yeah, I think we're not surprised that he was interfering in Ukraine. No question that he always had Ukraine on his mind as a place that he thought Russia should dominate. I think actually invading is not something in 2004 when we left we had thought would necessarily happen. But he absolutely had Ukraine on his target list in a lot of ways.
Do you see any opposition that he has to worry about, or he's going to die in office like Stalin did? Is that what you believe?
You know, he's already the longest serving leader of Russia since Stalin. I think people don't realize that, and he's still relatively young, you know, just 70 years old, in his early 70s. You know, in many ways, the system that Putin has right now is actually a more severe autocracy than even in the late Soviet period. Especially the restrictions in the public space. I mean, people are literally being sent to prison for years for, you know, posting something on Facebook. It's a very, you know, severely restricted political space that exists, and he's used the cover of the invasion of Ukraine as a way to consolidate the militarization of Russian society inside the country.
So are you thinking that he will stay the course, and unless he gets some land, he's not going to agree to any compromise or any settlement? And why do you think he seems to feel that he can maneuver President Trump to do largely what he wants rather than what the Ukrainians want?
Yeah, I think he feels like he's in a good position right now. I don't think he feels any pressure to make a deal. I don't think he feels any pressure to stop the war. His view is over time he's going to wear down Ukraine, and he doesn't find opposition from the United States at this point to be meaningful. You know, it's not about just land for him, though. What's really important is about the whole geopolitics of Europe. He wants to break up NATO in the West. President Trump has been doing a pretty good job of alienating NATO allies. He wants to have dominance over the former Soviet space. Even if he doesn't take all of Ukraine, he wants to be in charge of what happens in Ukraine, whether the land is part of Russia or not. And I don't think that it's a matter of like finding lines on a map that's going to settle that thing. I was in Alaska when he met with President Trump last summer, and he talked there about you know, the root causes. And when he says root causes, what he means is the West shouldn't have anything to do with my neighborhood. So
why is it that when people are opposed to Putin, they sometimes fall out of windows or they are poisoned? Is that to show a secret signal that these are our handiwork? In other words, why not just shoot the people, but why do you push them out the window or poison them? Why bother poisoning them? As we're talking, Navalny has been said to have been poisoned by a certain type of poison that the Russians developed. Why do you think they use those ways of getting rid of their enemies?
Yeah, the rare Ecuadorian frog poison, it seems like, you know, a little over the top. First of all, I think remembering that Putin not only grew up essentially in the KGB, but, you know, really his self-identity is of a man of the secret world. And he's always seen things in light of the secret machinations. In many ways, you could say that he built a KGB state in sort of the ruins of what, you know, Yeltsin's unfinished transformation. So part of it is that it's about being a spy man. I think another part is, as you said, the signature thing. Remember, he has done over-the-top, crazy things like sending polonium, that's basically a radioactive poison, into the heart of London to kill an early opponent. And I think he wants the credit for it.
Why do you think it is that he, unlike many political figures, they want to say, I'm a happily married man, and I have a happy family, children, and so forth. He seems obsessed with not having anybody know anything about his personal life. Why is that?
Well, because that puts you at risk. You know, when he first was coming to power, he told a story at a dinner once that we were told about. And one of the hosts had a daughter who was flying to London from Moscow that night and was going to have a black cab meet the daughter at the airport. And Putin says to this host, how can you do that? How can you put her in danger like that? Oh, this is London, she says. It's not going to be a problem. You don't know that. You never know that. He has this view that somebody is always out to get you. And to put your family out there would make him vulnerable. Now, of course, he divorced his wife, Ludmilla. His daughters are, largely behind the scenes. They don't make a lot of splash in the public space, and that's what he likes. He doesn't want to be vulnerable.
Okay, so right now you would say that the chances of his being overthrown by anybody inside Russia is about zero, right?
It's very low, yeah.
Okay. All right, let's talk about your second book, and that is on Jim Baker. Jim Baker wasn't head of state and not an elected official. Why did you think that he was deserving of a well-written book by you, but it took many years to put that book together? Why did you think he was deserving of such a comprehensive book?
Jim Baker is this incredible figure, and to me, it was always this way of telling the story of Washington. Really, if you look at from the end of the Watergate era, basically to the end of the Cold War, there was no more dominant figure certainly in Republican, but really in all of Washington than Jim Baker. So for me, it was, I think the initial attraction was the idea that also no one had written a full-length biography, like a real independent thing. He'd done his own memoirs, but it offered just sort of a unique chance to understand how power worked at this particular moment that became, the American moment, right?
So for those who aren't familiar with Jim Baker, can you say what positions did he actually have that gave him so much power?
Yeah, I mean, it was remarkable. He was the chief of staff to Ronald Reagan in his first term, Secretary of Treasury in the second term, and then Secretary of State for George H.W. Bush during the end of the Cold War and the prosecution of the first Gulf War. But even more importantly, I think, he also ran 5 presidential campaigns, and that's a unique skill set in Washington. Somebody who can both be a campaign operative and then also a statesman at the highest level. And I think it's like Karl Rove and Henry Kissinger all on the run, right? Henry Kissinger didn't run any campaigns. Karl Rove didn't negotiate peace treaties. Baker was playing on both levels.
So for those who aren't that familiar with Jim Baker, he was a good friend of George Herbert Walker Bush, a tennis buddy, and he actually managed George Herbert Walker Bush's presidential campaign in 1980. It didn't get to the campaign result that they originally wanted, and then Bush became vice president, or vice presidential nominee. But then after the election, Ronald Reagan decides to have Jim Baker, who ran a campaign against him and actually ran Gerald Ford's campaign in '76 against Reagan. Why would they pick a person who ran 2 campaigns against Ronald Reagan be the chief of staff?
You're exactly right. I mean, first of all, it tells you something about the nature of infighting in Ronald Reagan's inner circle, that in a way they wanted to bring in an outsider. I also think, Baker, one of the things he was a very canny reader of, the power map wherever he was. And, who liked him was Nancy Reagan. She thought, this guy fits the suit. And he's somebody who will represent my Ronnie. What they didn't want was Ed Meese, who had been Reagan's chief of staff back in California. Yeah, exactly, when he was the governor of California. And so it was not only a blocking maneuver, but you could argue that Baker's running of that 1980 campaign for George H.W. Bush, it got them both promoted, right? It got vice presidency for George H.W. Bush, and many people would say that Baker himself became the most powerful man, aside from Reagan, in Reagan's first term.
Now, George Herbert Walker Bush is elected president in 1988. Baker runs his campaign, and so the first decision that he makes, Bush as president-elect, is I'm going to make Jim Baker my Secretary of State. Yeah. And did Baker love that job? Was that the best job of the 3 he had?
Loved that job. Best job he ever had, absolutely. But what's really fascinating about that transition is how he makes that move from partisan warrior in the campaign, running a campaign that was not gentle. It had the Willie Horton ad, it had, the flag and the Pledge of Allegiance and all that stuff when Bush beat Dukakis. And then as soon as it's over, weeks after that election, and George H.W. Bush has just named him Secretary of State, what is Jim Baker doing? He's at the Watergate apartment of Jim Wright, who was the Democratic Speaker of, Bob Strauss, Bob Strauss, the chairman of the Democratic Committee, having dinner with Jim Wright, the Democratic Speaker of the House, because he says, let's figure out a way to end the Contra War. In other words, partisan until the election, find bipartisan solution afterwards. And that's what's so different about Washington today.
As Secretary of State, one of the things he'll be most remembered for is going around the world trying to raise money to pay for the first Persian War, first Gulf War. And he actually raised a fair amount of money. And he actually met with the foreign minister of Saddam Hussein. It didn't obviously produce anything. But was Baker very proud of what he did to kind of help that war move forward successfully for the U.S.?
Yeah, they called it the Tin Cup Tour. And actually, Baker was such a successful fundraiser, they used to joke that it was the first war that made money for the United States. Baker had this natural ability. As you pointed out, he didn't have any background in international diplomacy. He didn't really speak foreign languages. He had spent the first 40 years of his life as a corporate lawyer in Houston, Texas, where the name Baker really meant something, but it didn't really mean anything nationally, or certainly not internationally. And it turned out that it was, I think, those not just negotiating skills, but the ability to read what his interlocutor needed that made him so effective.
Now, if I had been the chief of staff, and it was considered the gold standard as chief of staff, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, I might say, well, I've met a lot of presidents and I can do this job too. Why didn't Baker run for president in 1996?
Yeah, he thought about it. He did look at it, obviously, and I think you're right. I mean, you're in that position, the natural thing to think is, I'm as smart as these guys. In fact, he and Bush, because they were very close friends, sometimes almost like siblings, they got into this back and forth, and whenever Bush got mad at Baker, he would say, how come you're not the one who got elected president? So I think you're right, it did kind of challenge him, but he looked around the map. This is just 2 years after the Newt Gingrich revolution. The Republican Party was beginning to change. He wasn't their kind of Republican, and he wasn't really an elected official type. He was much better as an appointed official. He wasn't somebody who was a natural baby kisser, back slapper kind of guy. The one campaign he ran was for Attorney General of Texas in 1978, and the guy who covered that campaign, I tracked him down, and he told me, he says, Baker would go to the state fair, and he would go right past all the people without even bothering to talk to them, straight to the back tent where the county judge was, because he knew how to manage power brokers more than he did, appeal to electorate.
Jim Baker is living in Houston. He will be 96 years old in April, and still going strong.
Going strong.
So let's talk about your third book. Your third book is about the first year of the Trump administration, of the first Trump administration, or about the entire, I should say, first term, I should say. So did Donald Trump actually think, when he came down the famous escalator, that he had any chance of getting elected president, or was he doing it to promote something else?
Always be selling, right? Donald Trump is a salesman. I think he saw it as a branding exercise. I don't think any of us really, or I don't want to speak for the rest of us, but I certainly did not appreciate that Trump viewed himself for his whole adult life as a possible president. He had weighed, I think, 5 different times that he was going to run for the president. People didn't really take him seriously. I don't know how seriously he himself took that idea. But actually, you go back, he was offering himself up as, for vice presidential consideration years earlier. He was a Democrat. He was eventually a Republican. He thought about being in the Reform Party that Ross Perot started. So Donald Trump envisioned himself in this role. But no, it's absolutely revisionist history. He didn't think he was winning. His campaign didn't think he was going to win.
So they had a pre-election transition headed by Chris Christie, former governor of New Jersey. And I don't know how much attention did Trump pay to that, because maybe he didn't think he was going to win. But when he won, why did they get rid of Chris Christie and have somebody else head up the transition? Well,
it was always an awkward thing to begin with. Trump was friendly with Christie, but Christie had been the prosecutor who would put Jared Kushner's father in prison. And so after the election, when the transition actually mattered, and it wasn't just a hypothetical exercise, I think that was never going to work out for Christie. He was never going to be able to stay there with Jared Kushner, exercising the power and influence that he did in that team.
Now, in the first Trump term, a lot of people came and went. I think there were 4 chiefs of staff, the White House chiefs of staff. This Trump term, there are not many people leaving, hardly anybody's left. No cabinet officer, no senior White House person, really. The NSC advisor left, but that's about the only person. Why do you think in the first term he had so many people coming and going, and this term he doesn't have that many people coming and going?
Yeah, I think the big lesson that Trump and Jared Kushner and others around him took from the first term was basically personnel, which, of course, most leaders will, learn that lesson eventually. And, for them, it became all about the loyalty test. It became all about Trump was basically stymied, in his view, in the first term by appointing a series of advisors he didn't really know well. They weren't his own cadre. He'd never worked in government before. That makes Trump such an outlier in our history, right? He's the first president never to have served in the military or in any previous government capacity, and it showed in this way. So he appoints people like these big burly former Marine generals, John Kelly to be his chief of staff, Jim Mattis to be the defense secretary. And it turns out some of these people are in his cabinet in order to stop Donald Trump as far as Trump is concerned, or to constrain him. And I think they saw the second term as loyalty above all. We're not going to have people here who aren't willing to do whatever it is I want them to do. And in fact, they're not only imposing a certain kind of loyalty test on the staff, but even to the level of, you can't have a senior position in this Trump administration unless you agree with the idea that the 2020 election was stolen.
So in the first Trump term, a lot of time was spent on the Mueller investigation, which President Trump said was a hoax because there was no collaboration. But there was evidence, was there not, that Putin was trying to influence the election some way? That's not to say that Trump knew about it, but is there any doubt that that actually was happening by the Russians?
I mean, this is the thing, right? He has oversimplified what Mueller's investigation found. What Mueller's investigation found was the Russians did interfere in the 2016 election. They did do it for the purpose of helping Donald Trump win, and they did it on a remarkably expansive way. And that doesn't mean that they changed the election, but it does mean that they tried. And it also found a remarkable amount of contacts between people in Trump's circle with Russians over the course of that campaign. That doesn't mean that there was a criminal conspiracy. That's what Mueller said, that he didn't find evidence to prove in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't shared interest there. And there were moments, as we know, in Trump Tower, for instance, when Trump's own son-in-law, and campaign manager met with Russians who advertised themselves as representing the government to deliver dirt on Hillary Clinton. They took that meeting. They were more than happy to have it. So it's not that there weren't interactions. It's just that it didn't add it up to a crime that Robert Mueller thought he could prove in a court of law.
Now, when President Trump ran for re-election, he lost to Joe Biden. Did he take Biden seriously as a potential opponent when he was running against Trump? And did Trump ever doubt that he won the election, or was he just kind of convincing himself that he won the election?
Yeah, these are really important questions, especially since literally every day, even though we're years later, we hear the president saying it was a rigged election and talking constantly about 2020. And actually, if you go back in time, I think we were lucky to be able to debrief and to interview people right in the immediate aftermath of that. So what we were told by some very senior people who did serve in that administration is that there were times in the immediate aftermath of 2020 when Trump would make a comment that suggested he understood he had lost. Like, I can't believe I lost to that guy, or, when I'm not here and when Biden is in charge. So I think, the evidence is pretty clear that he understood. And again, the reason why he understood he lost, let's be real, is that you would have to be completely delusional to believe that it was a rigged election in 6 American states with people all over the country and voting machines and whatever involved. That would be a conspiracy the likes of which is not only never been seen in American history, but would be almost logistically impossible to pull off. Because even if Donald Trump found 11,000 votes in Georgia, right, it wouldn't have changed the outcome of the election.
For a while during the first term, there was talk coming out of the White House staffers to maybe reporters like you saying that maybe he won't leave the Oval Office, maybe he'll stay. I don't know if that was just kind of a thing off the top of their head, but did Trump ever actually consider not leaving the Oval Office, to your knowledge?
I mean, there was talk of that, but I don't think it got very far. I mean, but he was clearly willing to do things that even went beyond what people expected, right? In the immediate aftermath of the election, there was kind of this attitude, it was reflected in an anonymous quote in the Washington Post, well, let him vent, it's fine, it won't actually hurt anything. And then he went much further. He entertained proposals to seize voting machines, to basically declare martial law in effect in swing states and rerun the elections. And you know what? He didn't do that at the time, but just a few weeks ago, he told my colleagues from the New York Times, I regret not having the military go seize those voting machines. So I think that with Trump, when people want to say, I don't think he would do that, he's shown in the past he's willing to do things that other presidents would never have done.
On the day of January the 6th, after Trump gave his speech near the White House, and then all the rioting broke out and so forth, was he shocked by what happened? And why did he wait a few hours before he did an effort to call them off? And I think Ivanka and other people tried to convince him to do something. Why did he wait so long, in your view, to do something?
Well, I mean, what the testimony has shown, and we did this reporting kind of in real time right after they left office. And then, as you remember, there was the House January 6th committee that investigated this. And we heard similar versions to what then became public testimony, which was people in the White House saying Donald Trump was sitting in that room off of the Oval Office that he would sit and watch TV in almost all day long. And he was like transfixed by the violence. He might have even been watching, he had a DVR, he might have been watching on a little bit of a time delay. Ivanka, we were told, came down to his office at the urging of other staff to try to beg him to call off the people. But he didn't want to do it. And, it's that silence and the resistance to doing it that for many people, I think was shocking because, again, there are a lot of people who now very publicly are the Trump supporters, people on Fox News and other things. But the record shows, we have a documentary record that shows that, Sean Hannity, who now promotes, the lies about what happened on January 6th, he and others were frantically texting all their sources like Mark Meadows and Donald Trump Jr. on January 6th and saying, we've got to stop this. This is horrible. We've got to call him off. When
he left the Oval Office and left the White House and went back to Florida, do you think at that time he ever thought he'd be president again?
That's a really good question. Almost nobody else did, right? It seemed like he was a spent force, that this was done. There's no way he could come back. But I think pretty quickly he showed that he was determined to try, and that he managed to confuse and surprise everybody by holding on to the base, by convincing them about the stuff about the 2020 election that wasn't true. And once the other Republicans realized that he was still the most dominant force within their party, he began to come back from this setback.
And the failed assassination attempt in Pennsylvania, did that propel him to be even more determined to get elected, or what impact did it have? When you see a bullet going by your head, it can focus your brain.
Yeah, I think you're right to come back to that. I think it was an incredible moment in the campaign. And, I like many people, remember seeing that image, the photograph immediately of Trump, thrusting his fist into the air. And, I had a sense, I think a lot of people had a sense like, that's it. This is the moment that he won the 2024 election.
So today, would you say that he's happy that he's president of the United States? He's a happy person? Or is he, dealing with all the problems he's got to deal with? But you see him from time to time, and when you meet with him, you interview him, or you see him in the White House, is he a happy person that he has this job? Or it's just like most presidents, it's a bit of a burden?
Well, I think he likes being the center of attention. Right, he always has. That's been his modus vivendi since his days in real estate in New York. He would go into. He didn't mind being in the gossip columns, even if it said terrible things about him, as long as it had his name spelled right. He once was heard telling an aide, "It's totally fine. They can write anything about you as long as they don't call you a pedophile." Now he's the center of attention. Everybody turns on his every word. He gets to name things after himself. He gets to put his picture in different places. He gets to maybe rename a whole class of battleships after himself. And I think he likes that. I think he likes the attention. I think he likes being at the center of things. I think he likes control. And I think he likes having the ability to, snap his fingers and have a say on all kinds of things in American society, not just politics and government, but also sports and culture and other areas where he can have an influence.
Yeah, although I have to say, it's fascinating to me that you asked the question, is he a happy person? Because now that you say that, I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe Donald Trump in any context as happy. I think, right, like he's such a relentlessly, sort of insatiable character, right? He's insatiable for money, for attention, for fame. That's the other reason that he might be happy, though, is because he's clearly also making billions of dollars off of the presidency.
I mean, he said recently to a CNN reporter that she didn't smile, but it's very rare to see Donald Trump laugh.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe he's laughed many times. I just haven't seen it, but he doesn't seem to laugh a lot.
No, he doesn't like to. He doesn't laugh a lot. He doesn't smile a lot. And he has photos taken. He wants to specifically not smile. He doesn't like to smile in photos. He has what they call the stare, and he'll ask his aides sometimes, "How was the stare?" He has this idea that it makes him look, ferocious and formidable and historic and man of destiny. Going to your point about the assassination.
Of all the presidents that you have covered, who is the smartest?
They're smart in different ways, right? They're smart in different ways. I think Bill Clinton was smart in the way he saw different elements of policy and pulled them together in ways that most people wouldn't. Barack Obama was smart, his aides would say, is smart in a very more linear way, like a lawyer. Bush was much smarter than people give him credit for. He read a lot of books. He was much more informed than people gave him credit for, but he'd like to play that down. He'd like people to underestimate him, as he put it. So I think, they're smart in different ways.
But Donald Trump is the most accessible of all the presidents you've covered. He seems to be talking to the press all the time.
Absolutely. No question about it. We don't have to guess what he's thinking. He tells us every single day what he's thinking. Every other president might try to disguise it or shade it or put it in some sort of noble terms. I'm really doing this for the American people. Trump tells us exactly what his motivations are, and he doesn't disguise them.
So when you first started covering things in Washington, there was a thing called bipartisanship. And I don't know if you've heard of that.
What is this strange term of which you speak?
Is the lack of bipartisanship, is that the biggest change in Washington, D.C. since you started covering things here?
Yeah, that is a huge change. But actually, I would say that it's the idea that you can just do so many things that were unthinkable. What Trump's era, and it really is an era, I would say that Biden is sort of this interregnum, but really it's a 10-year period at this point of the Trump era in American politics. And it's shattering so many different norms and expectations. Bipartisanship was one of them, but in some ways it was always honored more in the breach. I was the editor of Foreign Policy magazine. People always talk about, politics stops at the water's edge, but actually that was never really true, right? We always fought over things like that. And, even some of the policy fights we're having now, they're very extreme, but they're not unprecedented in American history. What's unprecedented is a lot of the stuff that Donald Trump is doing in the presidency and that the Republican Party is going along with. The founders had this idea that there would be co-equal branches of government where Congress would see its institutional interest in standing up for its prerogatives. It's unbelievable that the President of the United States would just be eliminating agencies that have been created and passed by Congress and Congress not to stand up for itself.
So the President of the United States, covering the President is considered a big honor in journalistic circles. But being a White House correspondent is not as much fun as it might seem because you're kind of in a narrow area. Yeah. You can't wander around all that much. Developing sources is difficult because people are afraid they might be seen as leaking something, and so they're very nervous about it. What's the pleasure of being a White House correspondent?
It's a great question. It's not sitting in a pool van outside of a golf club for 4 hours waiting for him to finish, but that is part of the job. And so people think it's glamorous. Obviously, there are moments when it's not. But you are there for history. You do have a front row seat at history. You are in the room at times that your kids and grandkids may look back at and say, what was that like to be there at that time? We're writing this book about Russia. I was there in the room in 1998 during the ruble crash when Russia's economy was completely collapsing all around it. And there was Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin together, each of whom had his own crisis. Clinton had just testified in the Monica Lewinsky investigation. I was there when Bush flew on Air Force One over New Orleans after Katrina, such a politically disastrous decision on his part. I thought it made sense because he could look at it without actually landing and getting everybody distracted, but to be there on the plane with him in that moment was a piece of history. So having a chance to be there in history is pretty remarkable.
So you're writing a fourth book together, and this book is on U.S. presidents' views towards and the way they've handled Putin. Is that right?
Right. It's sort of 25 years of how did we go from the U.S. exporting democracy to Russia to not only there not being any democracy in Russia, but the most deadly and catastrophic war in Europe since World War II. So, it's kind of a look at, what are the patterns? Because it's 5 different presidents, you can really see Democrats and Republicans. A lot of the story, it rhymes even if it doesn't directly repeat.
I assume you won't be getting an interview with Putin for this book.
Well, by the way, I'm on the banned list from Russia. Peter is not. They don't tell you why you make the list, but
okay. So when is this book coming out?
When we write it.
When will it be done?
You know better than to ask that question.
No, you don't know. Okay. So you still go back to your regular way of doing it. One writes a chapter, the other one edits it. Is that how you do it, more or less?
Well, I mean, that implies there's a little bit more kind of, serialness to it. I would say we've been engaging in, how toddlers parallel play. You know, we need to get to the collaborative stage of this more.
So how does writing a book compare to being let's say, a weekly or daily journalist? Which more pleasurable?
You know, well, first of all, I mean, this is actually kind of a unique moment in Washington. Peter and I are very lucky. You know, we have covered amazing things in our careers here in Washington, but this is a different moment. It's a different news cycle. It's very high stress. And I think for both of us, we found a certain refuge, not that it's such a lovely topic to be thinking about, you know, how did, you know, this terrible dictator come to power in Russia, but I think for us it is kind of absorbing to have a longer term project. We've loved doing the interviews. The other thing is, if you are a daily journalist or a weekly journalist, the chance to sit down and debrief with secretaries of state and, you know, defense secretaries and national security advisors, and to understand these events better. There's never been a story that Peter and I have written about, I would say in our books, where I haven't learned something new by going back, you know, for the book. And, you know, it's just a much deeper understanding of what's been happening.
Peter, you've written 3 books by yourself, so why didn't you want your wife to be on those books?
Why do you assume I said no? Maybe she's the one who said no.
She didn't want to be on those books. So what are the 3 books you've written that are unrelated to writing with your wife?
I wrote a book about Clinton's impeachment and trial in 1998, 1999 called The Breach. I had covered that. Susan was my editor on that. I wrote a book on George W. Bush and Dick Cheney's partnership called Days of Fire. And I wrote a book on Obama's presidency called Obama, The Call of History.
So of all the people you've interviewed, not just presidents, but all the people who've seen in public life in Washington, for both of you, who is the single most impressive person in terms of their ability, their intellect, their charm, and their ability to get things done? Is there one person or 2 that jump out to you?
Am I allowed to say David Rubenstein?
No. So there must be somebody you must be really admiring of or really thought was impressive. Doesn't have to be a president.
Look, I would say that, you know, what we would often say is, well, we've written 3 books together, and one was about Vladimir Putin, and one was about Donald Trump. So you can imagine who our favorite subject was. Jim Baker is a very impressive character, and that's a good example for me of going back to stories. You know, if you had told me when I was in high school in the 1980s that I was going to write a book about Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, and I was going to find him to be, you know, one of the most impressive people I'd ever met, I probably would not. I would have been pretty surprised by that.
So I know Jim Baker, and he always said that his father drummed into him this aphorism, which is, I think it was, you have to be prepared.
Right.
The
prior preparation prevents poor performance.
Yes.
Known as the 5 Ps in the Baker family, because every one of their children had that also drummed into them.
So, but I assume you both agree with that. So for your preparation, when you're doing interviews, you prepare, and when you're writing your books, you're very well prepared. You do a lot of research. And is doing research harder today or easier because the internet's got a lot of information? Do you have to run around the world and do the interviews, or you can do a lot of them by Zoom or other methods like that?
It's so much more accessible today. There's so many different things out there you can look at. In a book like that we're doing now with 25 years worth, there are documents now becoming available, documents we've asked to have declassified. Obviously, there are memoirs out there. There are oral histories. But there's also, because of like WikiLeaks producing all these cables and diplomatic memos that came out, there's a lot more material, I think, than ever before. And in some ways, the challenge is not finding the material, but how to process it all and make sense of it all.
So how has the newspaper world changed since you got into it? It used to be there were a lot of newspapers everywhere. Now there's hardly any newspapers. And is it really dispiriting to work in newspapers these days, or is it basically just something you have to ignore and just get on with the job?
Well, I mean, look, there are a lot of news outlets that have replaced it. There aren't as many physical papers anymore, obviously. But it's, it's not the same. And I think that there's something lost in the great old ink and
no,
paper
I mean,
newspaper.
there's a huge tragic moment. We met each other at the Washington Post. Peter Baker came up at the Washington Post. He was hired there when he was 21 years old, worked in the Metro section, which has now been abolished. I mean, you know, part of the crisis of politics in the country is a crisis of journalism, because you have cities and states and whole large metro areas where we're not covering our local politicians, we're not holding them accountable, and that means that our democracy isn't working the right way. And it just now, the idea that one of the world's richest men would have done that, to Virginia, Maryland, and DC, and that already happened to foreign correspondents. When Peter and I went to cover the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, when we were correspondents based in Moscow, every single news organization that I traveled around Afghanistan with, because I was just on my own there, within a few years, they were out of the business of foreign correspondents entirely. They didn't cover the world.
You were both in Afghanistan, or?
Yeah.
And didn't you feel unsafe a little bit when you were a journalist covering things?
Well, I'll tell you, you asked me, I grew up in suburban New Jersey, and I never heard a gun fired until I was covering the Battle of Tora Bora for the Washington Post. It was really...
You weren't both in the war zone at the same time.
We were, but separately.
Different parts, yeah.
But you're both in a war zone at the same time. You have one child.
He wasn't born yet.
Wasn't born yet.
I don't recommend this.
So for somebody young who is watching and wants to be a journalist and or a book writer, what skill set would you recommend that they develop? What is the skill set that enabled you to get to the top of the profession? And what skill set would you recommend, or courses or kinds of areas of study you would recommend to students today?
Persistence, resilience, never giving up, never taking no for an answer. That doesn't mean be obnoxious. Unfortunately, sometimes we journalists look obnoxious. That's not what I'm talking about. But I do think that knocking on every door and coming back again and again, whether it be looking for a job or in the act of reporting, is critical to any kind of journalism.
You?
Curiosity. It's amazing. I do think the willingness to be told no. This is it's a kind of a rough age, and I think people have retreated a little bit, and just being willing to put yourself out there.
So someday you will no doubt probably have grandchildren, and when you do, and they're sitting on your lap, and they ask you, what is the most memorable thing in your journalistic career? The high point, the thing that made you the happiest or the most memorable, what would you say? Other than this interview.
Damn, you got me there. I mean, look, I would say that, for Peter and I, being foreign correspondents, leaving Washington, where our careers really were, and moving to Moscow and ending up in Afghanistan, that was really, they talk about ground truth, and until you've been in another place like that, I think so much of what we assume here is just wrong. And that was invaluable, life lesson. Your job as a foreign correspondent is to, if you come to the roadblock, it's to find a way through the roadblock and to head towards the shooting. And when you do that, other challenges don't seem as hard.
What's your most memorable moment? Where were you on 9/11?
We were in Moscow on 9/11. We had just come back from Minsk, Belarus, where they'd had an election.
Tell them it was our first anniversary.
It was our first anniversary. This is not, does
a
not
very
speak well.
romantic husband. He
Well
took
of
me
the
to
husband,
Minsk on our first anniversary.
Who doesn't want to be in Minsk on their anniversary? We went to Minsk. On 9/11, we were in Moscow, and we obviously watched it. And
The highlight of your journalistic career, other than that time in Moscow, was what?
Well, at highlight, the most memorable, to Susan's point, I think was flying in an old rickety helicopter run by the Northern Alliance rebels over the Hindu Kush into Afghanistan, having no clue what I was doing. I had no clue what I was doing. I was the first American newspaper reporter to go into rebel-held Afghanistan after 9/11.
Were you worried for your life?
I wasn't worried for my life. I was worried how I was going to file a story. How was I going to figure out what the news was? Well, I wouldn't know anything. I didn't understand this place. I had never been there before. There was no electricity. There was no water. There was no food. I had nothing with me. And I was incompetent. I didn't know what I was doing. And so I was much more scared about failing than I was about being physically hurt. Physically hurt, that's one thing, but failing was not an option.
So on the whole, would you recommend a career in journalism and book writing to young people, or would you say consider private equity or hedge funds?
Let's just say that there's one billionaire on the stage here. As parents, we're very, very proud of our son, but it's not necessarily, I don't think in good conscience you could say to a young person that this is going to be your path to financial security. But, the world needs storytellers, and it certainly needs investigative reporters more than ever. So we couldn't be prouder.
$1 billion isn't what it used to be, Alex. So in your case, what would you would you say you would recommend this career?
It's not for the faint of heart. I think Susan's right. I mean, we need journalism more than ever. This is the absolute, if you can't buckle up and get on the horse now, there's no point in being in journalism, because this is the biggest story of our lifetime, what's going on right now here in our own country. It's not a career that will be stable. It's not a career that will provide a lot of future comforts, maybe. But it is a career that will never be dull. And you will, I will never regret having a chance to see this country and the world and meet the people and see the things that I've seen.
So when we want to see your next book, when do you think it will be ready? Is it 1
Would you
year?
like to come over and give us some, counseling
Is
to
it 1 year,
get through
2
it?
years?
Our publisher might be watching this. So the answer is as soon as we can.
Okay. Look, you've both been great to come here, and I appreciate everything you've done for the country as great journalists, and letting everybody know how you've been writing books and stay happily married while you're writing books together. That's not an easy feat, as you know. So thank you very much for coming here. I hope you had a good time.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
This is wonderful.
Thank you for doing this.
After the interview, David Rubenstein, Peter Baker, and Susan Glasser viewed artifacts from the Library of Congress's collection relating to other husbands and wives who are also professional partners.
So what you have here is from the Ruth Bader Ginsburg papers, from the ACLU portion. This is Moritz versus Commissioner, which is not one of the cases she argued in front of the Supreme Court. It actually preceded that. Went to the U.S. Court of Appeals, 10th Circuit. Now, but Marty, who was Marty Ginsburg, her husband, was a famous tax lawyer, and brought her this case, which initially she dismissed as, I don't read tax law. But then she looked at it again and realized it's a really good case. It's basically about a man who's never married, but he's taking care of his mother and tried to get a tax write-off for the care. But the law, as it was written, prevented men who were not married or not widowed from getting it. And she realized immediately there was a gender distinction there. Right. And so even though this case did not go to the Supreme Court, it crystallized her thought on gender law and equity. And you see here, these are the oral arguments she used in Moritz. Now she wins the case, and you see the 14th Amendment. These are her annotations. What's critical about it is that as she goes through the case, she realizes the broader scope of it, and she appeals to Marty Wolf, who was leading the ACLU, and you see here in this letter, he wouldn't let her on the case for Reed versus Reed, which was another case that did go to the Supreme Court in 71 and was decided in 72. And you see here, she says, is it time to have a woman on the case? Question mark, question mark, question mark.
3 question marks.
And because of her arguments in Moritz, he brought her on. Now, she does not argue the case in Reed versus Reed, but the brief she wrote, along with Pauli Murray and Dorothy Kenyon, who are also pioneers in the field, does lead to the victory, unanimous victory at Reed versus Reed, and starts off a string of victories over gender law and equity at the Supreme Court.
That's so cool.
Okay.
That's pretty amazing.
Now, Moynihan, you know Moynihan?
Yeah.
Are you guys familiar with Elizabeth Moynihan?
Of course.
So she just passed about a year ago. What's less known about her is that she actually ran all his Senate campaigns and was his major policy advisor. And what's interesting here, this is his 76 campaign, his initial campaign in 76. And you see there's her on the campaign trail, but there's also her making lasagna bolognese. So kind of doing the double, yes, I'm a homemaker, but I'm also a woman of the world, pushing through this campaign. And this is her itinerary for when she's going to Buffalo. Now, you know she's talking to chambers of commerce, women's groups, and at the top you see Tim Russert, because that's where he got his start, is on the Moynihan campaign.
Yeah, people forget that.
And at the end, when she dies in her obituary, Lawrence Donald was commenting, because he was one of his former chiefs of staff, said, Pat's legacy is really her legacy, because he ran everything by her, and she was a lobbyist on his behalf in the Senate as well.
Oh, really?
It makes me think of all the, Eleanor Roosevelt traveling around New York State on behalf of her husband's gubernatorial campaign.
Absolutely.
Something about New York.
See more with Peter Baker and Susan Glasser with the Library of Congress's artifacts, and watch past episodes of America's Book Club at cspan.org/ABC and C-SPAN's YouTube page.